started. Okay, today we're going to go over the financing commitment and appraisal contingencies. We're going to go through them line by line. We're going to chat how we use them in practice and some different nuances when it comes to the VA loans and I think. So we'll get started. Please ask questions along the way, please. Joan, would you like to say something?
No, I just said I'm back. Good.
Okay. So the financing contingency, it's line 247 to 287 of the WB11. The main sections of the financing contingency are the describing the terms of the loan, language around satisfaction of the contingency and steps to fully satisfy it, seller's termination rights, and what to do if financing is unavailable. So first up, the first section describing the terms of the loan. So on line 248, if you're going to include the financing commitment contingency, you're of course going to mark the box with an X. And I always like to say that if you are not including a contingency in an offer, to please put NA in a box versus just leaving it open. I think it just shows good practice to show that you've gone over the contingency with your buyers when you're describing or when you're going over the offer to purchase, that you didn't just miss it. So again, if you omit a contingency, please just write NA in that box. All right, so this offer is contingent upon the buyer being able to obtain a written, and then in the line 249 is a blank line, and you're going to put the loan type in this field. So either conventional, FHA, another product that you might use in this market is a jumbo loan. So put the loan type. I don't know who's on. If we can mute all. Perfect. So this offer is contingent upon buyer being able to obtain and I'll just say conventional loan, conventional first mortgage loan commitment as described below within blank days after acceptance of this offer. So this is where you're going to put the deadline days count in. So I put in 25 to 30 here. This is definitely a question that you are going to ask of the lender. In today's market, you might want to see if your lender can get loan commitment even faster than 25 to 30 days. I'd say that 25 to 30 days is what's typical. Maybe 25 to 35 days actually is more appropriate. But I, for example, in today's market, have a lender that my go-to lender can do it in 21 days. So obviously when we're writing competitively, the sooner we can make that contingency, the better. So definitely have a conversation. Yes, Sharon.
Oh, who do you use for your lender?
Ryan Boney of Cardinal Financial is somebody who can do it really fast.
And how do you spell Ryan's last name?
Boney.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the financing selected shall be in an amount of not less than blank, and we're going to put in the loan amount. So what will inform this number is the purchase price minus their percentage down. So if it's a $200,000 purchase price, and they're putting 20% down, you would put $100,000 in that line for a term of not less than blank years, amortized over not less than blank years, where you'll put in the timeline of the mortgage loan. So whether it's a conventional 30-year mortgage, conventional 15-year, 10-year, if it's a 15-year, you'll put 15 and 15. Likewise, if it's a 10-year mortgage, 10 and 10 on those lines. Initial payments of principals, or I'm on line 252, monthly payments of principal and interest shall not exceed blank. So you're going to get this number using your loan calculator. And the app that I use is Carl's Mortgage Calculator. You can just download an app. That's Carl with a K. So you're going to take your loan amount, the term of the loan, and the interest rate, which you'll find on line 264, which will and you'll plug those numbers into the mortgage calculator, and that will spit out the principal and interest payments. That's what you'll put on line 252. Buyer acknowledges that lenders' required monthly payments may also include 1/12 of the estimated net annual real estate taxes, hazard insurance premiums, and private mortgage insurance premiums. So this is a provision and an FYI to the buyer. When I'm going over a buyer consultation, for example, is usually when I'll address this. Just a reminder, and their lender will be going over this with them as well, but the totality of their mortgage payment is not just principal interest, but if they have an escrow account, it might also include the monthly payments for taxes and insurance. So just as long as your buyer is understanding of that full mortgage payment. Sorry. Now I gotta get back here. Ever since my iPhone did an update, I don't know how to get back. Hang on. Thank you so much. Here we go. Anyway, just in educating your buyer on this process, again, just as a checkpoint for you to let them know what their full mortgage payment might be. The mortgage shall not include a prepayment premium. Buyer agrees to pay discount points in an amount not to exceed blank of the loan. Joan might be able to speak to this more insofar as the last time she put in points here. In all my days of writing the terms of a loan, I've never had to include the.
How about 1985?
Okay. So there you go. So you will likely not be putting in some points on line 255, so you can just leave it as blank. The buyer is using multiple loan sources or obtaining a construction loan or land contract financing. Please describe those at lines 543 to 551 or in an addendum attached for line 573. So lines 543 and 551 are just those blank additional provisions lines that you can use. I don't know, me personally, I've never had to describe more than one loan type, but I'm sure but you can use those lines.
And just remember, it's popped up a couple of times, especially in purchasing land. You can, if the seller or buyer wants to use a land contract, this is the only reference that you as a real estate sales agent would put on line 249. You'd put land contract. The rest of it, the actual drafting of the land contract, we totally discourage you from drafting those, and they should be drafted by an attorney because you're actually writing up a mortgage, and we just don't feel that, or everybody feels that salespeople should not be drafting land contracts. In 1985, when we used to buy down points for a loan because the rate was so high, we also did a lot of land contracts because there wasn't money available. And back then, we used to draft land contracts right and left. But I'm sure half of them weren't legal. But we're saying right now, don't draft a land contract, but you can put it in line 249 if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, I've come across land contracts only twice. And yeah, you have to write both of those. So, and that's also a document that is recorded at closing.
Right.
So yeah, for what Joan said, definitely have an attorney do that. All right, so buyer, okay, another provision for the buyer. Buyer agrees to pay all customary loan and closing costs, wire fees, and loan origination fees, to promptly apply for a mortgage loan and to provide evidence of application promptly upon request of seller. So just a note about that. And it's not required, I mean, in addendum A language, there is language that addresses the loan application process. But I highly encourage everybody to make it a part of your practice to supply evidence to the listing agent as a buyer's agent, to supply evidence to the listing agent that your buyer has applied for the loan. And I just get that evidence with an email from the lender confirming Mr. Lender has X, Y, and Z buyer officially applied for the loan. Yes, they have. Then I'll document that and pass it on to the listing agent. This is just really important because in order for us to make our deadlines, the appraisal deadline and the financing commitment, the financing commitment contingency, they need to apply for that loan right away. I've definitely run into cases where a buyer has not, they were shopping around, they were dragging their feet, they didn't choose their lender in time, and missed deadlines. So, we had to go to the listing agent and with our tail between our legs, ask if we could extend some contingencies, and they were not happy. So anyway, just make it a part of your practice and reminding the buyer they need to promptly apply for the loan. And I'm also very heavy in with communicating with the lender directly. As part of my process, I will shoot over a copy of the offer to purchase to the lender myself, along with the dates and deadlines, and just make sure that communication is happening. So, all right, seller agrees to allow lender's appraiser access to the property. So as a listing agent, this is just a reminder to the seller, when we accept an offer with a financing contingency, we do need to allow that appraiser into the and I would go one step further and say that the home should be in tip-top shape as if it were a showing when the appraiser is in. Line 260, loan amount adjustment. So if the purchase price under this contract is modified, any financed amount, unless otherwise provided, shall be adjusted to the same percentage of the purchase price as in this contingency, and the monthly payments shall be adjusted as necessary to maintain the term and amortization stated above. So as if, let's say you're countering back and forth and this $200,000 purchase price ends up being 210, you do not need to rewrite the terms of this loan to match that 210 purchase price. It will just automatically adjust with the purchase price. All right, lines 263. This is where you're going to put reflect the interest rate. So 9 times out of 10, you guys will just be working with fixed rate financing. The annual rate of interest shall not exceed. And so what informs this number is the daily rate. And then we always encourage a cushion of a 5% cushion in case by the time the buyer locks in on their rate, between the time that you wrote this offer and by the time that they locked in their rate. And what this number means is this is not what the buyer is necessarily locking in at. It could be much lower than this, but this is communication to the seller, letting the seller know that if rates do go up to 3.5%, for example, we will still go through with it, and we will still be comfortable making that purchase. So I've had buyers question that when they see the interest rate on that line, and they'll come back to me and say, well, that's not what our interest rate is for our lender. And I'll just re-remind them how that works.
Yeah, and just from the point of view, if you're the listing agent representing your seller, when you get a offer that on line 64 has a interest rate of very close to what it actually is, say 3% or lower than that. To protect your seller, you would maybe counter a little bit higher rate because you don't want the rate to be so tight to the existing or so low that it's an easy way for the buyer to get out if the rate goes over that. So protect your seller and ask for a little bit more of a cushion on the rate.
This is Dan. I got 2 questions.
Yes, go for it.
Are you using line 264 with the rate to calculate line 252 yeah, you are padded. So they're both padded.
Yes, they're both padded. Yes.
Got it. And then the other question, line 250, you actually put a 5-day window in there and not a specific date? Or is this just an example of 25 to?
I was giving a range of the possible days that you would put in there.
Got it. Okay. Right.
So
Makes sense.
but again, back to that, confirm with the lender how much time they
Sure.
really need. So,
Thank you.
yeah, good questions. And then the adjustable rate mortgage, I'm not going to go through how to put in those numbers. I'm going to defer you to the lender to get those numbers. So if anyone has questions about adjustable rate financing, I'm just going to grab those from the lender. All right, any questions so far? Any other questions so far? All right, so the satisfaction of the financing commitment contingency, seller termination rights, and financing commitment unavailability. We're going to go through next. I'm just going to do one check on participants. We are good. Okay, so how the financing commitment contingency gets satisfied. So starting at line 27, the buyer qualifies for the loan described in this offer or another loan accepted buyer, which we're going to go over that in a minute. Buyer agrees to deliver to seller a copy of a written loan. The contingency shall be satisfied if buyer's review, buyer delivers to seller a copy of the written loan commitment, even if subject to conditions. That is either signed by the buyer, so the loan commitment letter itself can just be signed by the buyer, or accompanied by deliverer's written direction for delivery. So it used to be permission to deliver notices, and some people are still using those, which is perfectly acceptable. But now, again, we can just have that loan commitment letter signed directly, and then we can deliver that to the listing agent. Delivery, and here's a note, delivery of a loan commitment by buyer's lender or delivery accompanied by a notice of unacceptability shall not satisfy this contingency. So the buyer's lender, for example, cannot just deliver loan commitment directly to the listing agent. It's got to come through the buyer and the buyer's. All right, so I'll continue on with this and then we'll circle back on a couple things. The delivered loan commitment caution. The delivered loan commitment may contain conditions buyer must yet satisfy to obligate the lender to provide the loan. Buyer understands delivery of a loan commitment removes the financing commitment contingency from the offer and shifts the risk to the buyer if the loan is not funded. So this is very important. Sometimes you'll receive a loan commitment letter that still has conditions on that are left to be satisfied by the buyer. If that loan commitment letter is delivered and the buyer was not able to meet one of those conditions and was not able to get the loan, the onus is still, or the risk is shifted to the buyer now, and the buyer still must go through with the closing, even if they were not able to get the loan. So that is very important. If there are conditions on a loan commitment letter, let me backtrack. The lender is going to be working hard to only deliver this loan commitment letter to the buyer once all conditions have been satisfied. On occasion, there are still administrative conditions left to go. that, that's more on the lender to satisfy and get taken care of. But there might be other conditions that the buyer must still satisfy. Have conversations with the lender once you receive these loan commitment letters. If you see a big laundry list of conditions left on there, I would have a phone conversation with the lender and ask them, is there anything on this list that you have any fear of the buyer being able to satisfy? They'll be able to talk you through that. Their response might be, no, this is all just administrative stuff. They're good to go. We have everything from the buyer themselves. It's safe to deliver. If there's something on there, though, that the buyer must provide to the lender, and for whatever reason may not be able to, then we might want to consider extending the loan commitment contingency versus delivering this loan commitment letter. I would say it's rare that they're delivering loan commitment letters with any conditions that would be hard for the buyer to satisfy. But we need to be asking those questions because it's delivered and something was not able to be satisfied by the buyer's in trouble. So, Joan, any other comments on that?
Well, one of the bigger scary ones, conditions, is that they have to provide proceeds of the sale of their house. Yeah. And say they've written the offer because it's really competitive and they haven't put in a house sale contingency, but they have pretty good feeling that their house is going to be sold. They may already have an accepted offer or something like that. But the lender giving this loan is waiting for the proceeds of that sale. So that will still be a condition on them getting this loan. So say they don't have a house sale contingency in their offer and they get their loan commitment, but it says don't forget, we're going to need the proceeds of the sale of your existing house. If they went ahead and signed that over to the seller and the house deal fell apart of their house, they would be stuck. I mean, they would still have to go to the closing table and buy that house, and the lender would not be issuing them a loan commitment because they didn't sell their house. So some of these conditions can be very serious, impacting the buyer, and make sure that it's not delivered without the buyer carefully reviewing the contingencies or the conditions and talking to their lender about it.
And actually in that last writing in competitive market panel that Corey Lamont had hosted, yes, she talked about this, and it would be very dangerous to do something like that without writing a home close contingency in your offers if you do need the proceeds from the sale of your house. So I think the question at that time was, you bury a home close contingency within a financing contingency, and she just said that would be a huge, huge risk for a buyer. So we've got a couple more people here. All right, any questions on that so far? Okay. I'm going to circle back to the line at the very beginning of the satisfaction of the contingency. So if buyer qualifies for the loan described in this offer or another loan acceptable to the buyer. So it is a case on occasion where a buyer might switch loan types mid-transaction, which is permitted within how the contract is written. Where it's necessary for a seller to agree to the loan type change is if it is a loan type that would affect the appraisal or the seller's responsibilities within with the loan type. So an FHA loan, for example. So let's say the buyer went from a conventional loan to an FHA loan mid-transaction. If the seller has to make repairs based off of an FHA appraisal, which we're going to talk about that at the end of this whole thing. But if it's something that the seller might have further responsibilities on or for in terms of the loan type, then the seller has to agree to that change. But it is permissible for a buyer to change loan types midway. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, I got a question. Oh, go ahead, Sharon. Sorry.
That's okay. Okay. Even if it's a cash deal?
So we can, well, I didn't include that, but we can go over that language. But if there is a cash, if the offer has not been written with a financing contingency, and buyer chooses to obtain a mortgage, is that your question, Sharon?
My question is this actually happened. The original offer to purchase said cash, but then, and they had the cash, but they had to get it out of their 401 or wherever. In midterm of this, they decided, no, I'm going to get a loan. I don't want to touch my 401k. Could that be okay in this situation?
It totally can, and it's actually not even these lines are not what covers that. There's actually lines within the offer. If the offer is not contingent upon a financing commitment contingency, there are lines in there that state that buyer may obtain a loan if they wish. And it even spells out the fact that the seller must allow an appraiser in. But if the buyer, for example, let's say they decide midway that they do want to obtain a loan, interest rates are so low, let's just get a loan, I would rather do that than tie up my money in this. That's totally fine. But if they don't get that loan in time, just for like underwriting purposes, let's say, then they still need to rely on their cash terms and bring cash to close if they're not able to get that loan.
Yeah, the important distinction is they can, if it's a cash offer, they can on the side get a loan instead. The difference is they cannot make that loan now contingent on the offer.
They can't make the loan contingent upon the offer. Okay, there's a
it's still considered a cash offer unless you do an amendment and the seller agrees to that. But you can't change it to a financing offer midstream unless the seller agrees. But if the buyer alone wants to get financing because they don't want to use their 401 or something like that, it's still considered a cash offer. They can get a financing, the appraiser can be let into the house and everything, but financing is still not a contingency in the offer.
Okay, caveat to that. Same problem, same actual case. Then we at Keller Williams are very well educated on stuff like this. However, the problem came when the other agent had no knowledge that you could do this or refused to agree to it. Then what do you do?
Point back to the offer.
Pardon?
Point back to the offer. The language is right in the offer. And here. I'm going to pull it up.
Only if the seller says, okay, I'll change the offer from a cash to a financing offer. And then you get an amendment to both agree. But if both parties don't agree, if the seller doesn't agree to that, and I don't know why they would, if they have a cash offer in their hand, why would they all of a sudden now agree to a financing offer? They cannot switch.
That's exactly what happened, John.
Yeah, they can't.
The other agent didn't want to even deal with it. He was so upset that, and I'm saying, and there was money. I mean, there was money.
But well, hold on. I want to make a distinction though. If the seller is refusing to have an appraiser in,
no, it has nothing to do with the appraiser.
No, right.
The contract still says if the buyer wants to change and get it financed, not a contingency, but of just his own financing. It says in the offer that the seller must allow the appraiser to go in the house.
Right. No, that's what I guess what I'm saying is that a seller doesn't have to agree because they already did agree when they signed the offer. But if they want to,
Yes. Yeah, but they have to agree to have it be a contingency in the offer.
What
It's,
what contingency are you saying? The
they
finance,
would have to agree to accept a financing contingency instead of a cash offer.
so then I should have gotten in writing that it was okay with the seller to do that.
If it was okay with the seller.
If it was okay with the seller.
It's like recently we've been having these offers written without an inspection. And then the buyers get really nervous and they still want an inspection, but they know that they only got the offer accepted because it had no inspection. So they're asking, can we still have an inspection, not as a contingency, but just for our own information? And it's the same idea. You know, I wrote a cash offer. It is a cash offer. But now I want to really, for personal reasons, get it financed. Can I get it financed? Sure, but not as a contingency in the offer. You get it financed on your own, whether it's accepted or not, that's your problem.
Okay,
It does not become a contingency in the offer.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
and Sharon, just for your purposes on this, it's lines 302 to 307. Actually, I'm going to adjust that 303 to 307.
Right.
All right, let's get back. Seller termination rights. Now, if the buyer, so let's say you've got that financing contingency deadline of 30 days, and that 30 days comes and goes, and loan commitment has not been delivered. It does not automatically mean that the deal is null and void or dead. It now just gives the seller rights in the offer to declare the offer null and void. So how it reads is, if a buyer does not deliver a loan commitment on or before the deadline on line 250, seller may terminate this offer if seller delivers a written notice of termination to buyer prior to seller's actual receipt of the written loan commitment from the buyer. So the buyer still has an opportunity at any time to deliver that loan commitment letter. And once they deliver that loan commitment letter, if the seller has not delivered notice declaring the offer terminated, then they've satisfied the financing contingency and they're going on to closing. But now at any point prior to that loan commitment being delivered to the seller can declare the offer null and void at any time with a notice. So just keep that in mind when negotiating.
And especially today's market when a lot of sellers have a secondary buyer.
Yeah.
The minute your loan commitment is late, your offer can be null and voided in a millisecond, and they can take that secondary.
Yeah. So any questions about that? Dan, you had a question earlier before Sharon's question. Did you want to?
Yeah, my question was along the lines of I've had buyers who have written in the financing contingency and they've said, you know, I'm going to put 20% down or 25% down, and then later on they decide, well, at closing I'm only going to put 5% down. Can they do that? It seems a little dishonest or disingenuous, because obviously it's more attractive to the seller because they see a much larger number as down payment. Or does it not matter because it's a contingency, they're still required to get financing for that?
Right. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer this without muddying this up. Because that happens all the time. I guess the implication is that they can't deliver a rejection letter based off of putting less than 50% down. Dan.
Correct.
So, I mean, I don't want to say to use it, that it's being used as a strategic tool to show a seller that they have, in these offers, everything is competitive. And when you see an offer that has 50% down, and then you go to closing and 5% down, I guess at the end of the day, all you care is that it closes and that
Right.
they do it.
Are
It's a thing. It is definitely a thing out there, right? That we hear that people are like, well, you know what, let's put 30% down, but we're only going to come to the table with 5 or 10% down.
But Steph is right. If their underwriter rejects that loan and say they switch to a 5% down and the underwriter doesn't like that and rejects the loan, the buyer cannot use that rejection letter to get out of their financing because it'll show that they were rejected on a 5% down loan when in their offer, the seller agreed that they were going to get a 20% down loan. And so that rejection letter doesn't match the contract and they are still obligated to close
But
at 20% down.
they wouldn't be able to, even if they applied for a loan that allowed 20%
Right.
down. They're going to
That's
get
the risk, but
The
that's the
underwriter-
risk of doing that.
the underwriter's just going to say, oh, okay, you want a 20% down rejection letter? Either way, if you can't get 5%, you're not going to be able to get 20%, right? So it's really a technicality there. Then they
Right.
would go back to the underwriter, they would get a correct letter, and then they'd be able to exercise the financing contingency. So it sounds
Maybe they'd get a corrected letter. I mean, I know that there would be some lenders that would not falsify that.
yeah, I mean, they have ethics standards
Mhm.
that we do.
sure. I mean, absolutely it would still be ethical to then say to the lender, well, in my financing commitment contingency, I said that I was going to put 20% down. In all good faith, I thought I could put 20% down. But I thought, I wanted to save some cash at the end of the day. So I only did 5% down. And you're saying now I can't get the 5% down. In order for me to get out of this contingency, I'm going to ask you to approve me for 20% down. And they're going to say, I mean, it's good. It's still in good faith.
And they probably would be approved for 20% down, but the buyer would have to come up with that extra money. And they might, at that point, they may fit the window of being approved. If the lender's going to get 20%, they're going, okay, then we will approve this loan.
Got it.
But we're not going to approve this loan if you're only going to cash in 5%.
So that's where the risk is with the buyer.
Exactly.
Got it.
Right.
So the buyer can do that. They just need to know that there's a level of risk there that if they get rejected
Yes.
with the loan, it can cause not only, have to get underwritten, but it's going to push days out and it's going to cause issues.
And they may not get any kind of a rejection letter from the lender.
Got it. Okay, that's good to know because it seems to happen. It seems like once the finance, once they kind of get closer to financing, buyers tend to make these just, different agreements. And it, knock on wood, it's all worked out. But I guess I've always been curious as to what happens if it doesn't.
Well, I hear, and I've heard over the years, but I'm probably hearing more now, because of buyer's remorse in this competitive market, and they're putting in these offers that are way over and, not asking for anything, then they get scared and they look for ways to get out of the offer. And say the inspection contingency, they really couldn't find a way to get out of the inspection because they couldn't find a valve defect or something like that. Then they always think, oh, well, I can get out on financing. I'll just say something and I'll be able to get out on financing. When you talk to lenders, and I'd love to have a lender come and talk to us about things like this, lenders are aware of this as a ploy and are not buying into it. And mainly because they're seeing more of it. Well, I can always get out of the contract through my financing. And that's just not happening as much. I know there are a lot of lenders that are saying, no, you're getting your financing, you know, nothing has changed. You're approved for your financing. And the buyer is then stuck in that offer. But you're right, there's a lot more stuff going on.
What is our role then in that situation where they want to get out? They want to exercise a contingency that maybe they can't exercise, right? They can't.
Right. I mean, they can call an attorney and an attorney can probably get them out, but they're going to have to spend money on an attorney.
Sure.
Because we can't advise them
Yeah.
to do anything.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so financing commitment unavailability. So we kind of just went over that, but
Yeah.
If the financing commitment is not available on the terms stated in this offer, and buyer has not already delivered an acceptable loan commitment for other financing to the seller, the buyer shall promptly deliver written notice to the seller of same, including copies of lender's rejection letters or other evidence of unavailability. So that loan or that notice is going to state this is a notice of financing unavailability, and on the attachment lines is going to be the rejection letter or letters from the lender, and you will deliver that to the listing agent. Okay, I think next up is the financing or the appraisal contingency. So the appraisal contingency are lines 308 to 326 of the offer to purchase. There are two main sections, the appraisal contingency verbiage itself, and then right to cure is also attached to the appraisal contingency. So we'll go over how that right to cure works when there's an appraisal contingency. All right, beginning on line 308, again, you're going to mark the appraisal contingency with an X on the box next to it. If this offer is contingent upon buyer or buyer's lender having the property appraised at buyer's expense by a Wisconsin licensed or certified independent appraiser who issues an appraisal report dated subsequent to the date stated on line 1 of this offer, indicating an appraised value for the property equal to or greater than the agreed upon. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless buyer within, and again, I put a range of 25 to 30 days after acceptance, delivers to seller a copy of the appraisal report indicating an appraised value less than the agreed upon purchase price and a written notice objecting to the appraised value. So the appraisal contingency kind of works like the inspection contingency insofar as if the date for the appraisal contingency comes and goes, it has waived itself. Getting calls left and right during this hour, then I haven't had any calls all morning. So sorry about that, guys. So again, if the deadline for the appraisal comes and goes, just like the inspection contingency, it waives itself, and buyer cannot backtrack and try to renegotiate or get out of the deal if that deadline comes and goes. Like the inspection contingency, it's a Wisconsin licensed or certified independent appraiser who issues the appraisal report. And that appraised value must come in at purchase price or greater than the agreed upon purchase price. If the buyer receives an appraisal report at purchase price or higher, they'll just communicate with the listing agent that it appraised out okay, and you guys will go on to closing or go on to the next contingency, which would be the financing contingency. If you receive an appraisal below the purchase price, the buyer has a few options here. They can agree to bring the difference between appraised value and purchase price to closing, and they'll just work that out with their lender and they'll move to closing. They can attempt to renegotiate the purchase price either to the new appraised value, or they can split the difference between the seller if they want. and then amend the purchase price and move to closing. Or they can ask the seller to come down to the appraised value altogether. You're going to do that via an amendment, just like, our first attempts are always to negotiate on these things. And let's say seller declines to come down to the value. Then the decision is going to come back to the buyer to deliver a notice of defects, not notice of defects, to deliver a notice of objection to the appraised value. And now right to cure will be attached, and it works the same way. So if the seller has the right to cure in the appraisal contingency, if they receive that notice of objection of appraised value along with the appraisal report, the seller now has the power to decide whether or not to come down to that appraised value and keep the buyer in the deal, or they can let the buyer out of the deal altogether. If they have not been given the right to cure in the appraisal contingency, the buyer, if they choose, can use this as a way to exit the deal and just serve a notice of objection of appraised value and kill the deal themselves. So it works the same way as it does with the inspection contingency. You want to be careful again now with right to cure. You don't want to accidentally serve a notice directly to the seller as your first line of offense with this. Let's say that seller does have a secondary offer waiting in the wings. You don't want to give them the power to kill the deal if that is not your intention. So please make sure how you're using the appraisal contingency, because you could accidentally put your buyer in a vulnerable position. All right. Let's talk about the appraisal contingency and this market. Get to the next slide. So an appraisal in practice, an appraisal is going to happen regardless of whether, if there's a financing contingency and a loan on the home, an appraisal is going to happen either regardless of whether or not there's an appraisal contingency or not. If your buyer does not want to make the offer contingent upon an appraisal and they wish to rely on their financing contingency, if that appraisal comes in low, the buyer would still have an opportunity to get out of the contract if that appraisal value came in lower, and they would receive a rejection letter from their lender. So, we've been kind of commenting a lot along the way, Joni and I, that, you might want to have conversations with your buyers and so far as including an appraisal contingency or not in this market. It might be more advantageous not to include an appraisal contingency. As a listing agent, though, when all of these offers are going over asking by tens of thousands of dollars, a listing agent receiving an offer and coaching their sellers on the absence of an appraisal contingency, their red flag might be, well, we know that appraisal is going to happen. The buyer is still going to have an out through the financing contingency if this does not appraise. So you might want to protect your sellers and include language regarding that. Over the weekend, I wrote an offer. We did not include an appraisal contingency, but we did include verbiage stating that the buyer would cover the gap between an appraisal value and the purchase price, because I knew that that was going to be a question. I was working with a savvy listing agent, and I knew that that was going to be a question. So we included that language. There are a number of ways that we can address the appraisal contingency in this market. I've had even further creative language around the appraisal contingency where a buyer will say, If it appraises between the list price and the purchase price, we'll cover the gap and move to closing. If it appraises less than the list price, the appraisal contingency is in effect and seller will have right to cure. And that helps your buyers who, the unknown is going to be what that gap could possibly be. A buyer might know that they could cover a $20,000 gap, but they might not know if they could cover a $30,000 gap because you're not sure of where that appraisal is going to come, or that appraised value is going to come in. I don't want to get down too many rabbit holes, but I guess the communication here is that there are ways to address these gaps in appraised value and purchase price. Another thing that has obviously been popular is seller or buyer stating that they will go $10,000 over any appraised value, regardless of what the purchase price is. So let's say they wrote $250 on a home that was listed at $210 and the appraised value came in at $220. They're just saying ahead of time, we can go up to $230, and they're not committing to that purchase price. I feel like that has gone out of favor already because buyers or sellers don't get that purchase price that was initially offered and accepted upon.
And a word of caution here, if your buyer wants to write these things into the offer, very important that that buyer talk to their lender.
Yes.
Because their buyer is saying, oh, I'm willing to go 30,000 over what, the price is. And the buyer says, oh, I can do that, I can add. The lender's going to go, oh, wait a minute, where are you coming up with this $30,000 extra? And it could definitely affect the financing for your buyer. The lender's not going to want to see you throwing around big chunks of cash when they've reviewed all of your assets.
Yeah, that I should have spelled out right away. I mean, of course, these all have to be discussed. I mean, another thing that sellers, I'm going to backtrack again. So another thing that sellers have been requiring or asking of when we're seeing big chunks of money being around, as Joni described, as a proof of funds, an extra proof of funds that they have that money to do that. A listing agent has been asking for those kind of things. So we just want to kind of keep you guys attuned to what's been happening and the kinds of things we're seeing in the market. When we're going over this section, I just want it to be heard that if you have questions about including language like this, please see Joni and I, but then also, again, just verifications with the lenders and the financial ability of buyers to be able to do things like this. Any questions? No? Okay. We already talked about switching loan types midway through transactions. I'm not going to go through that again. Appraisal language in competitive markets. And then appraisals around FHA and VA loans. And this is just generally speaking, in a competitive market or not, when you are working with an FHA buyer or a VA buyer, the appraisal process looks a bit different than it does with a conventional loan. So if you do have an FHA buyer, just know that there's an extra level of checkpoint items that the FHA appraiser is looking for. So with an FHA loan, for example, there's what's called the FHA inspection, and that inspection is happening at the same time as the appraisal, is the same person doing it. And they're checking for safety items. A big example of that, I would think, that I've seen are like missing handrails. Peeling paint is a big thing. If you've got a home that has a ton of peeling paint that's going to be flagged in an appraisal inspection an appraisal process. And all of these things have to be completed if they're flagged in the appraisal, have to be completed prior to closing, whether the seller does it or whether the buyer does it. So, you know, if things do get weighed or flagged in an appraisal, FHA appraisal, you know, as a buyer's agent, you're going to request that the seller take care of them prior to closing. I will say, though, that I've had buyers say that they will take care of them prior to closing. And that's a risk to the buyer because they might be making repairs on a property that they do not own. But I've also had sellers just refuse outright to do them. So I've painted basements before for a buyer with a buyer at a vacant house. And I've also helped a buyer install a handrail. So that was interesting. Anyway, so just note that those are items that, again, have to be completed prior to closing. The lender will not close on it until those things are done. So in this market, though, having an FHA loan is a detriment when writing. So I think that's another conversation point with your buyers. You know, if you can qualify for a conventional loan, that is only going to help you in this market. So if they can't, I mean, that's okay too, but I think it's having a conversation with the buyers around it, though. And then VA loans, same thing. If there is a VA loan, they have that extra level of scrutiny in their appraisals as well. And then one more comment about appraisals and FHA loans. Whether or not there's an appraisal contingency when there's an FHA or VA loan, the lender requires that the buyer have an appraisal contingency. If the FHA if the home does not appraise, the buyer is able to walk away from the deal based off of appraised value, whether or not an FHA or whether or not an appraisal contingency is included or not. Okay, I'm gonna put it to grid view so that we can stop share so we can all talk. But are there any questions regarding any of this? Sharon.
My question is, what was that app that you talked about that was the mortgage calculator?
Oh, Carl's mortgage calculator. Carl with a K.
Oh, Carl, K-A-R-L?
Yep.
Carl mortgage calculator?
Carl's mortgage calculator. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. If you go in the App Store, there are a lot of them.
Yeah, that's just the one that I've always used. So.
Right.
Oh, Shalina. You're welcome. Anybody else? Okay. Well, as always, just come see Joni and I. We are here for you.
You have two questions that are not related to finance or to these two appraisals or appraisal and financing.
You've got a question, Dan? Okay.
Yeah, I have two questions that are not about appraisals or finance and contingencies, but if anybody else has any other questions about that stuff?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is on moving a closing date. When you move a closing date up, you need to move all of the other, on the buy side, you need to move all of the other dates up, correct?
You don't. I mean, you should, but you don't have to. I mean, you might, yeah.
If you're on the selling side, or if you're on the listing side, I completely understand how you would not want them to move the dates up. Well, I guess they're covered either way. They're covered because if
Yeah, I mean, obviously
after you close, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't move it up before the date of the appraisal contingency expiration, or you have to take into consideration what your timelines are and all the other
Yeah,
terms.
you
But-
move the closing date up 7 days, let's say, for example, which is what we just did.
Mhm.
We didn't move the other dates of financing commitment and loan commitment and appraisal. And I guess that still protects the buyer, because even if it comes down to the, the last day, something goes wrong, the dates are in the future after close date, so they still have those outs. Okay.
It all depends on how much time there is between the financing contingency and the closing date. So sometimes you got a 30-day financing contingency, but a 60-day close. Moving it up 7 days isn't going to, you're through your last contingency.
Yeah,
But-
this is really tight. This is a financing contingency. What is it? 720. We'll have to get the dates, but it's basically
The date was moved up so much that the appraisal and loan commitment were the same day.
yeah, the date was moved up so much that the appraisal and loan commitment were the same day.
That's okay. You just remember that there has to be at least 3 days prior to closing for the numbers to be set.
Okay.
So, and it gives you shorter time to negotiate. You're going to be up against a wall, maybe throwing amendments back and forth.
Sure.
But everything has to be settled. All the closing figures have to be settled 3 days prior to closing.
Okay. So really, that's the kind of the key date is the 3 days.
Right.
Okay.
And another thing too is back to just conversations with the lender. I mean, before the seller is the one who wanted to make this change, the response should be, let me check with the lender to see if they can do that.
Yeah, we did all of that. I mean, even before accepting the offer, they wanted us to move the closing date up, and we were like, we're not going to move it until we talk to the lender. And they ended up
Right.
accepting it, and then afterwards we ended up moving it up. The lender agreed that they could move it up.
Good.
So we did that. I think we're good there. So my other question is on, this is a fun one. If you have a property, there's a property on the MLS that says this property is for sale. And oh, by the way, I'm also selling my other 2 properties, and all 3 of these properties, which are all they're individually listed on the MLS, are tied into this one deal. Do you write 3 separate offers? Do you write like an MSA or a master offer that has an addenda that has the other offers within it in order for it to be kind of grouped together? Because
Well, I've had this experience with one of my agents. And is one of them tied? Like you can't buy this offer unless you buy the other piece with it?
I mean, I think technically no. They're all 3. I mean, on the MLS where they're listed today, they're all 3 separate listings. But it says in the private remarks, like, seller wants to sell all 3 of these as a package. And they're being sold as is. I mean,
Yeah, you can list them just as if, say, they all 3 had addresses. You could list all 3 addresses as property description.
oh, so you
That you're
so you would
writing.
list it- so you would do one listing or one offer to purchase with
Offer.
3 separate addresses. All of the contingencies would be the same.
Mhm.
And you may
They
have
have
to
to be.
write additional comments about, like, on this property, we want a home inspection, or this property, we want this. And then, okay, all right, that makes sense.
And the price obviously would be the total of purchasing all 3.
It'd be one large sum total of all of them.
Right.
Okay.
You can, I mean, I would definitely try it. Sometimes the seller would like to have them individually sold, but I doubt it if they're saying that.
Yeah, there are 3 investment properties, so they're,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, a lot of investment agents do packages all the time.
sure.
And so when they do a package, they'll list each address of the contents of the package.
Got it. I think that's what this is.
Okay.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
No, thank you for your questions.
Well, thanks for attending, you guys. Have a great 4th. There's no training next week due to the holiday. And then I'm sure Charlie will mention it in tomorrow's meeting, but there's not going to be a meeting next week, Tuesday either. So just so you guys are aware of that. And then
Party time.
what?
Said party time.
Party time, yeah. And Joni and I will still do our help desk on Thursday from 11:30 to 12. So any questions, bring them then. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Steph.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.